few weeks ago, we explored how Jews and Christians often have strongly divergent readings of the exact same passage of the Hebrew Scripture. From a related perspective this morning, I want to explore how Jews might read the Christian New Testament, the Christian Scriptures. In particular, I want to look at Jesus' parables. And next week, we'll take a similar look at some passages from the Tao Te Ching. We're kind of looking at different ways different communities read texts. And part of what inspired me to preach about the Christian parables from a Jewish perspective is a new book, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi by Amy Jill Levine. Amy Jill is a Jewish New Testament scholar, so you heard that right. She attends an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. She's Jewish, but she has a PhD in New Testament studies. And she teaches at Vanderbilt University. She describes herself as a Yankee Jewish feminist teaching in a predominantly Christian divinity school in the buckle of the Bible Belt. She's really, if you ever get a chance to see her in person, she's really dynamic. And really, so it sounds, I see a few of you nodding, some of you may have seen her. She's really fantastic. Levine's book invites us into an act of listening anew to sometimes familiar parables, of imagining what the parables would have sounded like to a Jewish peasant people who had no idea that this Jesus would one day be later proclaimed Son of God by millions, no idea that he would be crucified by Rome and of the way that crucifixion would be interpreted. What would they have heard just a Jewish storyteller telling them? I would say further that we should seek to hear the parables as Rabbi Jesus himself intended them, because the historical Jesus had no idea that he would one day be declared co-equal with God, an idea he would have found blasphemous. From a Unitarian Universalist perspective, I hear this view as inviting us to see the parables as about deeds, not creeds. I once led a youth retreat, a week-long youth camp about the parables, and the theme was running with the parables. How do we run with them? How do we use them to form the way we're living our lives? And the youth minister who designed the t-shirts for that week, he designed a red t-shirt, and it had two people running down a street and two bulls chasing them. Some of you may get that. Running with the parables. Pair of bulls. So I'm not sure all the youth got that joke, but I have the t-shirt. I can bring it in. I know. Oh, it's clever. You're just sorry you didn't come up with it yourself. Many traditional interpretations of the parables see those stories as just all about God. It's Jesus teaching us about God. But a deeds, not creeds perspective on the parables invites us to consider how Rabbi Jesus is inviting us not just to believe differently about some other theoretical being, but to act differently ourselves. In that spirit, I invite you to hear this parable recorded for us in the 20th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, and to listen to it with an ear toward deeds, not creeds. Listen for how this story might be inviting us to change. The beloved community is like a landowner. The beloved community is like a landowner who went out early in the morning for pancakes. Who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. And after agreeing with those laborers early in the morning at dawn for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. And when he went out again about 9 o'clock, so he'd been out earlier right at dawn, he went out at 9 o'clock, he saw others in the marketplace, wanting work, but not able to find it. And he said to them, "You go also into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. And now he went out again about noon. So this is the third time. Dawn, 9 a.m., noon. And then about 3 o'clock. And again he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out again and still found other day laborers wanting work, but not able to find it. And he said to them, "Why are you here wanting work, but not able to find it all day?" And they said, "No one has hired us." And he said to them, "You go also into the vineyard." And finally, when evening came, so he's been hiring people all day, and finally when evening came, he said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, but begin with the last and go to the first." And when those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last, they worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage way back there at dawn? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to these last the same that I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" As you've heard me say before, the Universalist half of our Unitarian Universalist heritage is about the shift from teaching that all will be universally saved in a next world and a denial of hell in the next world, to loving the hell out of this world, here and now. Likewise, one traditional interpretation of this parable, often known as the parable of the workers in the vineyard, is that God is the landowner, the vineyard is our work in this world, and the payment at the end of the day, metaphorically the end of our lives, is whom that landowner God will reward with heaven. Is it only the people that have worked their whole lives, or the people that have had what they used to call a deathbed baptism, right? As Augustine prayed, "God make me chaste, but not yet." So this parable can be seen as teaching through an otherworldly lens that God is more generous than we might expect or deserve, and chooses to let people into heaven, even if they've just done a tiny bit of good, only at the end of their lives. In the words of the parable, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat, perhaps for a lifetime." But what if we take up Amy Jill Levine's challenge to consider how this story would have been heard by impoverished Jewish peasants 2,000 years ago? What if we listen for what Rabbi Jesus may have been saying, not about God in heaven, but about this world, this life, and how we act and treat one another in it? What if instead of calling this story the parable of the workers in the vineyard, we consider some of the alternative titles that have been proposed over the years? The parable of the complaining day laborers, the parable of the surprising salaries, the parable of the humane capitalist, the conscientious boss, the last hired or the first paid, how to prevent peasants from unionizing, debating a fair wage, lessons for both management and employees, or the parable of the affirmative action employer. Now, before we proceed much further, I mentioned earlier that it's often illuminating to explore the ways that the Christian scriptures often recapitulate and echo the Hebrew Bible, that they're often the Jewish writers, as well as Jesus himself, were deeply steeped in the Torah and the prophets, and that's often recapitulated in the Christian scriptures. And it's likely in this case that Jesus' familiarity with a passage from 1 Samuel is what inspired him to tell this parable. 1,000 years before Jesus, King David ruled the United Kingdom of Israel. And in 1 Samuel 30, we see the story, which you could call the parable of equal compensation for soldiers, if you will, in which David went on in pursuit of the Amalekite army. So King David's leading the Israelite army against the Amalekites. He and 400 men, but 200 stayed behind. They were too exhausted to cross the valley and continue pursuing the Amalekites. 10 verses later, when they returned victorious, we read in verse 21, that when David drew near to those 200 soldiers that had stayed behind, he saluted them. But in contrast to David's generous greeting, the foot soldiers who had been in battle declared, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give to them any of the spoils that we recovered." But David rebukes them in a way that presages Jesus' parable. For the share of the one who goes down into battle shall be the same as the share of ones who stayed by the baggage. They shall share alike. Verse 25 goes on to say that from that day forward he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel. It continues to this present day. And a millennia later, when Jesus is one among quite a few people who were declared to be the Messiah, but that's for another sermon, part of what it meant is that Jesus was hoped that he would be a king like David. So in David's day, there had been a united kingdom of Israel. In Jesus' day, the northern kingdom of Israel had been destroyed hundreds of years earlier by the Assyrians. There was just the southern kingdom of Judah, so there was this hope for a Messiah that will come, kick out Rome, the new Assyria, and restore the united kingdom of Israel. So the hope was that Jesus would be like King David. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than all that. That when you talk about restoring that golden age under David, people forget things like David had Bathsheba's husband killed to cover up his affair with her and many other things. So it's all a lot more complicated than is often revealed or than people nostalgically remember. But to return our focus to our parable, when those day laborers hired at 5 p.m. received a full day's wage for working only 1 hour, those who were hired at dawn and who had worked a long 12-hour day leapt to the conclusion that they must be in for an equivalent surprise of much more than that usual daily wage they had agreed to at dawn. Shouldn't they receive 4 times more than those hired last, since they had worked 4 times as many hours? And hearing their grumbling, the landowner says, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. I choose to give the last the same as what I give to you. Am I not free to choose what I do, what belongs to me, or are you envious because I am generous?" You can hear how that can be read through a libertarian lens. We'll get back to that. And keep in mind that Davidic echo from a millennia earlier, that the share of one who goes down into the battle shall be the same as the one who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And when you read this parable from the perspective of a call to love the hell out of this world, it's important to consider that both then and now we have day laborers, and both then and now the day laborers picked first at dawn are the youngest workers. For those workers in their prime, the landowners paid the usual daily wage. It's basic economics, supply and demand. To enlist those workers at greatest demand, you have to pay the standard rate. But when the landowner went out about 9 o'clock, there were others that had been left behind. So probably at dawn, there was a bunch of landowners out there and a bunch of workers, and so the landowner picked the ones he wanted and carted them off, but he didn't. But he came back at 9 and saw, oh wait, there's still people here. Wanting work, not able to find it. The landowner had hired all that he needed already. Perhaps he had assumed other landowners would hire those other workers, but they hadn't. So seeing them, he hired them and said, "Not that I'll pay you the standard wage, but I'll pay you whatever is right." So he doesn't agree to pay those less desirable laborers the same that he had paid his first-round draft picks. Nor do the laborers haggle with them. They're eager to be paid whatever seems right, because anything is better than returning home to their families with nothing. When the landowner went out again about noon, at about 3 o'clock, he did the same, and then most shockingly, of course, at the end of the day, at the end of this 12-hour workday, still people are standing around, and he tells them to come to the vineyard too. So perhaps an even more controversial title for this parable could be the parable that all people who want to work should be given a job and paid a living wage. After all, contrary to what sometimes seemed to be popular opinion about the Christian Scriptures, Jesus' message is about what would Jesus do, not what would Ayn Rand do, right? So from a perspective of full employment, Jesus' parable invites us not only to praise the generous landowner, but also to reflect on the plight of the day laborers and to see it from their perspective. Yes, the landowner could be called, in our libertarian political speak, a job creator, right? He did generously create jobs that might not otherwise have existed for a host of workers. But it's important to remember that the usual daily wage for manual labor that even those first-round draft picks were given, it would have been a denarius, a Roman silver coin, approximately the same value as a Greek drachma. Rabbinical sources tell us that that rate was actually not generous. It wasn't miserly either, but it was basically a subsistence wage. It allowed them to have a daily bread just for that day, but not to invest in anything, not to do anything extra, not to get ahead. It's a low minimum wage. It's a subsistence wage, not a sustainable living wage. Turning the tables, perhaps what those full-day hard workers were actually excited about. They weren't being greedy necessarily, but maybe when they saw those late workers getting paid that standard subsistence wage that just got them through one more day, knowing that they may not get picked the next day, then maybe for once they were going to get a living wage, enough to maybe get a little extra and get ahead just a little, to give them a little breathing room financially. That insight gives us ears to hear that libertarian landowner's words, not only as well-intentioned and lined with some generosity beyond what he had to do, but also as unintentionally paternalistic, as condescending, as oblivious to the serious day-to-day struggles of those laborers that he hires. So on one hand, yes, he's generous for paying so many extra people a minimum wage. On the other hand, he's paid none of them, nor does he ever, or has ever paid any of them, a living wage. By hiring day laborers, he's still keeping all the power to himself. He's not giving any of those workers the security of a long-term contract. I'm going to hire you for more than just a day, or I'm going to give you benefits and make sure you're taken care of. Remember as well that Jesus himself was an itinerant Jewish peasant. It's likely that who would have been Jesus' audience for this parable, right? Probably those day laborers that were standing around at 9, at noon, at 3, and at 5. They had time to listen to an itinerant Jewish storyteller because they hadn't been hired. And maybe his audience was also some of those landowners who after they hired that dawn laborers, were free to wander around because someone else was doing their work. They too may have had time to listen to an itinerant Jewish storyteller. And Jesus' parables, when stripped of later otherworldly interpretations that were laid onto them, reveal the original radical stories of a traveling Jewish rabbi reinterpreting the Hebrew prophetic tradition to condemn inequality and call for justice in his own day. In the words of Amy Jo Levine, this parable doesn't promote egalitarianism. Instead, it just is encouraging householders to support laborers, but to support all of them. More than just aiding those who show up on their doorstep, those who have should seek out those in need. If a householder can't afford it, he or she should continue to put others on the payroll, paying them a living wage even if they cannot put in a full day's work, and so allow them to feed their families while keeping their dignity intact. The point is practical, and it's edgy, and it's subversive. It's neither Marxist nor capitalist. Rather, Jesus is an idealist and a pragmatist. His focus is on the responsibility of the rich, and his concern is that everybody have at least a bare minimum. I'm grateful to those of you who have stepped up recently to make our 2-week shift at the Family Emergency Shelter possible. But may we also work for a world, not necessarily in which everyone is exactly equal, whatever that would even mean, given how different we are and the different gifts that we have, but for a world in which everyone who wants to work is at least paid a living wage, in which everyone has at least a simple, decent place to live, to raise their family. But in addition to such large goals, for now, in the coming days and weeks, I invite you to consider, what do you have in abundance? And there may be a lot of different answers to that question among us, but what do you have in abundance? And out of that abundance, to whom might you be called to seek out and practice abundant generosity? I invite you to reflect on that for a few minutes, and then there'll be some time for us to share. Allow your head to descend into your heart and respond out of that place. What do you have in abundance? To whom might you be called to practice abundant generosity?